My name is Michael Rakowitz. I make work that has made it a place where problem solving is also troublemaking. Oftentimes my work serves as a kind of reminder, and sometimes those reminders are inconvenient or unwanted. In January of '91, my mother saw my brothers and I looking at the television set and seeing the green-tinted CNN images of anonymous buildings being blown to bits. She directed our gaze away from the television by saying, "You know, there's no Iraqi restaurants in New York." And I think she saw that we had all of a sudden become split as people that were no longer little kids, but as people that were witnessing the place that our grandparents fled from being destroyed by the place they fled to. And I knew in that moment that I was going to probably be working for the rest of my life trying to save my grandparents' stories. The kitchen was where my grandmother and my mother often spoke Arabic. As Jews who left Iraq in the 1940s when my mother was young, they were heartbroken to leave a city like Baghdad. But one of the things that they did to keep that story and that place alive was to make sure that Iraq was still a place that was accessible to them, that they could reach for. I always talk about my grandparents now as being the first installation artists that I ever met, because what was on the floor was from Iraq, and what was on the walls, the artwork, was from Iraq. What was coming out of the stereo during family parties was from Iraq, and what was coming out of the kitchen was definitely from Iraq. Nimrud is one of the former capitals of the ancient Assyrian Empire. There was a palace that was built in the mid-800s B.C. There were about 600 of these reliefs that adorned the walls throughout this palace. About 400 of those 600 were taken to these different museums in the West, like the Louvre, like the British Museum, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. When the collectors or the museums would say, well, we don't want to pay for the shipment of an entire relief, our audience would probably respond more to the head of one of these figures, and they would simply slice off the head and send that as a reduced shipping cost. And you end up with these beheadings of the sculptures that had this awful symmetry to the beheadings that were carried out by people like the Islamic State. The 200 that were left in Iraq were destroyed in 2015 by the Islamic State in the aftermath of the US-led invasion, along with the 15,000 artifacts that were looted from the Iraq Museum in 2003. Together with a team of assistants, I've been to scale rebuilding the artifacts that are listed as missing, stolen, destroyed, or status unknown. And in the 14 years that I've done this project, we've made about 900 of the artifacts. And so it's a project that will clearly outlive me and my studio, which is kind of the point. One cannot simply rebuild or reconstruct history. And so the works are reappeared as a kind of spectral presence or placeholder. When I was living in Brooklyn in 2004, I was frequenting the same grocery store that my grandparents used to go to. One of these days I walked in and I saw a can of date syrup, which my family's history, it was very important. It's important for many Iraqis and Iraqi Jews. The owner of the store, Charlie Sahadi, looked at me and he said, "Your mother's going to love this. It's from Baghdad." And I said, "But it says product of Lebanon." And he explained to me that the date syrup is actually processed in the Iraqi capital, put into large plastic vats, driven over the border to Syria, where it gets put into these unmarked tin plate steel cans, and then goes over the border to Lebanon, where it gets labeled and is sold to the rest of the world. And from 1990 until 2003, this was one of the ways in which the Iraqis had circumvented the UN sanctions. So all of a sudden I saw these products. I was surrounded by these wrappers, these beautiful, graphically rich wrappers of all this food stuff that couldn't tell me where it was from. It was almost as if the pressures of xenophobia had been visited on these commodities. They were like an immigrant that couldn't tell me where it was from. It was a veiled provenance. And so the empty store made me think about the empty museum. And so I started to think that the skin that these artifacts should wear when they came back was the skin of these other objects that couldn't tell you where they were from, that couldn't tell you their provenance, where you have these families that are surviving, that they're making sure that they can continue to transmit these recipes. They refuse to disappear. And that's, for me, a way in which to point to survival as a form of resistance and also as a form of joy. For me, when I'm making these, I'm thinking about them being placeholders for the lost lives that can't be reconstructed or can't find refuge. What I try to do is to put the audience into the situation of an Iraqi in that room the day before ISIS came to destroy it. The Iraqis were looking at these reliefs, but they were also looking at the gaps in between, the spaces that were left behind when the excavations happened and those works were then removed and then sold to institutions and collectors in the West. That one sees the degree to which people like the Iraqis have had to look at their culture in fragments, and to show that this is not a displacement and a violence that begins and ends with ISIS in 2015, and about the value and the care being given towards the objects, but that care and that valuation was not applicable when it came to the people. But I'd like to work in ways that invites people in. And I'd like to believe that we can get to a place where people can live wherever they want without displacing, what's come before. I have to be continuously idealist and utopian about that, because that is what I fight for. There's so much about art that is just proof of life, the fact that we're experiencing these things together. People are always cynical about the way that a demonstration is not going to stop a war, and a piece of art won't stop a war. But what it does do for the demonstrators, it shows that they're not alone. That there is something about strength in numbers where one is not allowed to believe what often creeps in the darkness, is that they're isolated and that they're alone. I think that the one thing that I can ask for from my work is to add a voice that lets people know that they're not alone. And so when I think about cultural heritage and antiquity, Iraq should not have to be humanized only through the past, but we can use the past that we feel we all share as a way to wields something not as nostalgia, but as a blueprint for the future.